note that this conference is now being recorded. I now welcome our session presenter, Gauri Gokhale, who heads our TMT practice, Rajesh Simon, who leads our international tax practice, and Arushi Jain, who co-heads the IP practice. Over to you, Arushi.
Thank you so much, Khaled, and thank you all of you for joining us today. We are going to talk about brands, all about brands and acquisition of brands today. Some of you may be wondering that, how can we have a 1 hour session on brand acquisition? I mean, at the end of the day, it's simple, right? You have one person who wants to sell a brand, another person who wants to acquire the brand. You enter into an assignment agreement, file it with the registry, and it's all done. Well, so be the case in most circumstances, but then there are exceptional circumstances, some of which we are living in today, and we never thought we'll be in this circumstance. Similarly, with brand acquisition deals, you do get into some very complex situations at times, and that's the reason why we decided to have this session. Now, between Gauri, who heads our IP practice, Rajesh, who heads our tax practice, and myself, we have done a lot of IP acquisition deals over the years. But somehow we have a soft corner for brand acquisition deals. We have very fond memories. So, what we did was we basically converted our memories into a webinar and decided to walk down this path with all of you. So, with this, I now open the session. Just a hygiene point that this session is going to be more like a rapid fire. First 20-25 minutes, I'm going to ask Gauri and Rajesh some specific questions on legal points, tax as well as IP laws. And the next 20 minutes will be spent on some case studies. So we are going to move very quickly from IP to tax to FEMA to competition law issues. So please listen in very carefully. So my first question to you, Gauri, as I kickstart, what are some of the key diligence issues that you have seen when we are doing brand acquisitions, and how does it impact the deal overall? What's your experience be like?
So I think you mentioned rapid fire. I can't speak that. Okay. So just to clarify, when we talk about brands, you will often find that you're not necessarily doing only a brand deal. Will be other assets that get transferred. But today, since you are focusing on brand, we will stick our discussion on that. But as and when required, we will bring out other issues as well. So coming to the diligence point, now whenever we are doing trademark diligence, and sometimes it so happens that it is a part of a bigger M&A or a joint venture, or some other asset transfer, etc. Typically, what we have seen is that the information that is given by the target is only taken at a face value. Now, when it comes to trademark, it is very fact driven law, right? Whether the mark has been used, to what extent has it been used. Trademark doesn't exist in vacuum. So in relation to which goods and services has it been used? So apart from simply checking whether a mark is registered, is it pending, are there any opposition, one needs to go one level down to identify what are the real facts, what is the journey of that brand, to put it very simply. When was the usage started, what has been hurdle, if any, etc. So typically what we will try to do is, when it's a pending trademark, you not only just look at the facts, you will also, as a buyer, take the evidence of the use of the trademark, because if it has been used, right? Because if at all tomorrow there is a challenge to the brand, or you have to file a passing off action, what is really required is the use of the brand, and you have to demonstrate that by evidence. So other than simply taking the registration certificates, I would typically want to take even in charge of the evidence of use, so that away basis what I have seen over a period of time. The other issue in the Indian context arises is the litigation issue, because as you are aware that not all the courts will have a searchable databases. So obviously there you will simply live with the reps and warranties, but to the extent possible, you will do your due diligence with the typical courts where such cases are filed, but that also not a full full scale due diligence that is possible. The other aspect you would look at is whether there has been any challenge to the trademark, or is there a potential challenge by the other party's use of the mark. So you will also look into other general public search, etc., and you will often find, and we have seen that happen, that there may be a foreign trademark. One doesn't realize, though it's that trademark is a territorial right. However, if there is a foreign use, there is a likelihood, and especially when you are looking at acquisitions, say from startups or small entities, they may not have paid attention to some foreign trademark that is a potential threat. Once some bigger company acquires that trademark, right? So some of these factual background, obviously is very very important, other than simpliciter what you see on the register. The last point I will make is about the journey, as I was saying, also the journey of the acquisitions, because oftentimes the trademark may have passed on hands and the recordal of that may not have been completed in the trademark registry. So one needs to also check why there can be hurdles, etc., and how you need to resolve that, if at all, and whether that is going to create hurdle for you. So I think these are the basic hygiene issues, but often missed out, as we have seen. And Arushi, I'm sure you also have a couple of cases that we had handled. I think one of the pharma deals where very interesting issues came up. So why don't you share a few instances?
Yeah, sure, Gauri. So let me say it very simply. When we started with that deal, it was basically an Indian pharma company which wanted to sell certain brands to another Indian pharma company. On the face of it, it looked very simple. We were hired. We thought we'll do an assignment deed, file the assignment deed, and we are done. When we started digging into the issues and doing the due diligence, like Gauri was mentioning, some key issues can come out. We realized that it is actually the foreign entity, the foreign subsidiary, or the foreign group company of this Indian entity, the seller entity, which owned the marks. Now, the handshake deal was very simple. The Indian entity has to be paid for the sale of trademarks, but the mark was vesting with the foreign entity. So that was one issue that we looked at. Now, as we evolved and went deeper into the deal, we realized that some of the marks that were to be sold were associated with other marks which were not part of the deal. Now, for those who don't know, associated trademarks is a concept recognized under our Indian trademark law. It basically means that two marks which are identical or similar to each other, which are applied for or registered in respect of similar goods or services by the same proprietor, can be associated by the registry. So, to give you an example, if you have a word mark, say Starbucks for coffee related services, and you have a logo mark, the registry may actually ask you to associate these marks together because they don't want confusion to arise as to who owns these marks. So can someone, hi, I think someone needs to go on mute here. Mukesh, hi, can you help us? I think some participant is not on mute.
Sure, let me check.
So, yes, so like I was mentioning, this concept of associated trademarks, the issue that arises is that when marks are associated with each other, they need to be assigned as a cluster. In this case, while the parties had agreed that there is certain number of marks to be assigned, they didn't contemplate these associated marks to be assigned. So what do we do? Do we go back, change the valuation? How do we assign? Do the numbers change? Commercials change? That's another other concern. Ultimately, the parties decided that these additional marks will be sold on an as-is basis. So that means no reps warranties attached to that. You can all imagine what a nightmarish commercial and legal negotiation that turned out to be. Other concern that arose is while these marks were very well recognized and known in the Indian market, some of them were not renewed. This caused some worry to the buyer in this instance. These are the kind of issues when you go deeper down into the transaction, the diligence phase, and which causes complication. So with that, Gauri, I put my first question to you. Actually, I asked your first question, so second question technically. What happens when the marks are owned by the group company, but the sale is to happen through another subsidiary? What are the kind of legal issues that arise in such cases, and what should one think about in these circumstances?
Sure. So typically what we have seen is quite a few group companies have a holding entity. The marks are owned in an IP holding entity, and the subsidiaries are using the trademarks under a license. However, the business of which is attached to the trademark is with the subsidiary, right? So in such situations, when I'm taking over the business of the entity, the question arises that the business is with the licensee entity, but the mark is with the other entity. So that situation, whether from an IP perspective, I'm sure Rajesh will have something to say on the tax front. But from an IP perspective, there are two methods which I will use. One is I take the business, of course, of the subsidiary, but the trademark, of course, I'll have to take from the parent entity. or if I have to, for whatever commercial reasons, because this also opens up the issues as to reps warranties, because because the value really, may be attached to the business, that the assets I'm taking. So maximum value may go to the one entity, but the brand, if I'm taking from the other entity, the smaller value may be going to that entity. So then the question arises on the reps and warranties and indemnities, and where, do I go after two separate entities if the issue arises at a later date? And how do I split that, the risk between the two entities? So just from that perspective, from IP perspective, I don't have a concern, which I will just take, relevant entity, relevant commercial perspective. My ideal situation would be to request the entity which from which the assets to take the brand, at a particular whatever group transfer, and take the issues, two levels of transfers, stamp duty issues, and the like, which as a buyer, I will ideally go with a single entity transaction.
Understood. And Rajesh, Gauri mentioned tax issues. Now, single entity transaction and two entity transactions. What's your suggestion in this circumstance, and how do you split this up?
So, Rishi, just going back to the example, right? You have the owner of the mark, which is going to be a foreign entity. At the same time, the marks are actually used by the Indian entity, presumably under a licensing arrangement. And the use of the mark has actually been done by the Indian entity. So there are two different limbs to the transaction. First one is that if we take, for example, a dual sales structure, where the Indian entity is selling the assets and the foreign entity is selling the mark. In that case, as far as the foreign entity is concerned, it is doing a sale or an assignment transaction. The important question which actually arises, especially on such kind of international transaction, is whether the transaction is going to be subject to Indian taxes. Generally, in case of intangible assets, including trademarks, the situs of the asset actually determines as to which country has the right to tax. In this case, the situs of the asset is not necessarily linked to where the mark is registered, but where the holder of the mark actually resides. So if you have a foreign company, even though they have a trademark which they have registered in India, if they are selling the or assigning the trademark, the situs will still be seen as outside of India. So to that extent, you will end up in a situation where there would not be an Indian tax. Obviously, there is a tax in the home country where the foreign company resides. And as far as the Indian entity is concerned, it is obviously doing a transfer of its business. So to that extent, the Indian entity, depending on whether it's structuring that as a asset sale or a slump sale, is going to be subject to capital gains tax in India. There are slight nuances between how a slump sale is taxed versus how an asset sale is taxed. But since we are going to focus on marks, I'm not going to touch upon that. The second kind of transaction, which, as Gauri mentioned, is what is the more ideal transaction that you would look at from a non-tax standpoint, which is consolidation of all the assets into one entity, and then actually transferring everything as a lock, stock, barrel. The one challenge which I see with that is that if you're trying to consolidate everything into one entity, presumably that means that the Indian company which is using the mark has to acquire the mark from the foreign company, and then it is then going to do a slump sale or asset sale to the buyer. And where you're going to end up in a situation where transfer pricing starts applying, because this will be treated as a international transaction, and valuation of marks then becomes a challenge, because what the buyer is acquiring is the business as a whole, including the marks, whereas what the Indian company is buying from the foreign company is only the mark. So you don't necessarily have a comparable that you can actually determine. So that whole apportionment then sort of becomes a bit of a issue. So there is always a bit of push and pull between tax and non-tax considerations when it comes to these kind of structures. The one other aspect which I will also touch upon is that when you're talking about a dual sale as compared to a single sale, where the foreign company and the Indian company are both actually trying to the Indian entity transferring business and the foreign entity the mark. The one other consideration that is that there is an outstanding license agreement between the foreign company and the Indian company. And there is also the question that it's actually the Indian company which has been using the mark. So the question that comes up is that if the license agreement is going to be terminated, or should the Indian entity be compensated for that from a transfer pricing standpoint? And possibly the second question that arises, and this is especially starting to crop up after the BEPS plan, which is the Global International Framework, where they've tried to sort of look at various anti-abuse measures. Where one of the issues that comes in is that is really the economic ownership with the Indian entity, and should it be compensated for that? So should there be a apportionment? So that becomes a slightly tricky issue. To my mind, again, at most the Indian entity's compensation should be for termination of license. But as I said, it's always a bit of back and forth that happens in any of these transactions. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Rajesh. I think you answered this so holistically. I may not need to go to my case studies, but I'm still going to hold you up for that. So let me move to the next concept. My next concept is goodwill. Now, Gauri, my question for you is, under Indian trademark law, you can assign a trademark with or without goodwill. Would you explain to our listeners what is this concept of goodwill? Can you do assignment without goodwill? What changes if you're assigning without goodwill, and does it even make sense?
Okay, so I think, yeah, so honestly, so traditionally, I mean, this, we have inherited our, Trademarks Act, of course, from, from the UK, right? This was a pre-British act which carried on even after, after new legislations that came in, carried forward that thought process. The inherent thought process under the act is that there are two possibilities: without goodwill, or you assign it with goodwill. Now, there is, in the Indian context, there is not much jurisprudence to give a complete background as to how the Indian courts, or how it will be interpreted, right? So typically, if you are assigning a trademark sans the business, right, as a going concern or otherwise, I can probably say that, okay, I'm just simply taking the brand and attaching it to a new business. Probably that is where I can probably argue that, okay, this is without goodwill. However, whatever deals I have done, probably in last 20 years, I've seen only 2 or 3 deals where there I have seen that it is without the goodwill. Now, when it is without goodwill, let's take a step back and understand what is the philosophy behind Trademark Act. One, of course, is to protect the ownership of the owner and the proprietor who has started the use of the brand or otherwise, but also consumer protection. That quite often people don't realize that that is the basis also of a trademark law. So when we are talking about consumer interest, what is important is for the consumer to be notified that this no longer attached to the previous business or the goodwill of the previous business, and will be attached to a new business, or a and this is being carried, the transfer is without the goodwill. So in that context, the law provides that there should be a particular followed before the assignment takes effect, that there is a ad required to be given in the newspaper. It may sound very like ancient, but there is a ad required to be given in the newspaper. The trademark registry needs to wait to see if there are any objections, right? Only then, the trademark, if there are no objections within a particular time, only then the assignment can get recorded. But if it is with goodwill, it's a simpliciter recordal, as you mentioned before. And then in that context, the recordal just goes as a matter of recordal, and not as a matter of that as a precondition for assignment. So that's the difference, right? The without goodwill is a precondition, whereas here it's simpliciter recordal. I'll just stop here. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Gauri. So without goodwill is basically a complicated process, but still some companies do decide to do it. But one must weigh whether they are assigning without goodwill or with goodwill. And if you're assigning with goodwill, make sure that your assignment agreements record that, because the registry will want to see that word. Otherwise, there could be complications in registration of assignment. Now, with
Just
that,
to just to clarify, no, just Arushi, you're absolutely right, because sometimes the intention is to do with goodwill, right? But internationally, that is not a concept, and that is the issue that we face when international documents come here for recordal of the trademarks. They forget, they don't really put the word with goodwill. Then we have to go back, ask, carry out an amendment, and then go for recordal. So the intention is there, but not in the words, unfortunately. Yeah.
Correct, and that's why documentation needs to be very clear, especially when you have India's set of trademarks. So Rajesh, this brings me back to you. Now, what I hear from Gauri is that when you look at assignment with goodwill, you're looking at two property or two concepts really. One is the trademark and one is goodwill. Is goodwill valued slightly differently? Does the tax treatment change with without goodwill in your view?
So I think I always struggle on this because I try to imagine what is trademark without goodwill, and I keep struggling as to how does trademark exist without goodwill. But as a concept, goodwill is a separate intangible property which is different from trademark. So, but having said that, even though there are two different kinds of intangible property, the tax treatment for both are broadly very similar. Both of them are intangible property. For both of them, if they are self-generated property, which means it's a mark which I have not bought from somebody else, or it's a goodwill which I have generated through my business dealings. Both of them, the tax treatment is that the cost of acquisition is treated as nil, everything is treated as capital gains. So, at least from a tax standpoint, there is no real distinction. And even tomorrow, once the buyer acquires it, it will go into the block of assets, the depreciation dates are going to be the same. So none of those aspects really change. So even though there are two different species of intangible property, uh, finally, I think the tax treatment will end up being more or less the same.
And does your answer change if we do a tranche payment vis-a-vis a one-time payment?
So the tranche payment comes with its own set of difficulties. And the difficulty with the tranche payment is actually the recognition of capital gains. Technically, when it comes to, because a sale of trademark or a sale of goodwill, all of these are effectively treated as capital gains in the hands of the seller. So what happens in that situation is that there is a deeming fiction when it comes to taxation of capital gains. To say that capital gains arise in the year where the transfer happens, and it is deemed to arise. It's not just arise, it's deemed to arise in the year of transfer. So the question that happens is that sometimes, even if I have a multi-tranche payment, if it's a deferred consideration, for example, that even if though the deferred payment, the second tranche has to come in after 12 months, for example, there is still then potentially an obligation for me to recognize the capital gains on day one. When it comes, on the other hand, to contingent payments, where there is a slight distinction where you sort of link it up to the revenue that you earn from the sale of branded products, and you provide a certain multiple depending on whatever parameters that you put in. Then the question comes in that since it's a contingent payment, unless the contingency arises, how can I actually recognize capital gains? So there, at least, there are some cases which give the indication that when it comes to contingent payment, you can recognize the capital gain in the year in which you actually receive the amount. So that's the two distinctions which I would sort of put in. And sorry, while we were on the call, I did see a question which came in specifically on situs of goodwill. The answer to that is that when it comes to all intangible property, it always goes back to the situs of the holder. So even insofar as goodwill is concerned, I would tend to think that the goodwill is still with the holder of the mark. The question, and which again for me is a transfer pricing question, is that if the Indian entity was actually the entity which was using the trademark over a period of time, should a portion of the goodwill be associated with it? But to my mind, if the license agreement under which the Indian entity had the mark itself provided that that while they have the right to use the mark, but all goodwills and all benefit will be with the foreign entity, The foreign entity will be continue to be the holder of the goodwill also. So there is no question of further apportionment around it. Your license fees ought to have taken care of the fact that the goodwill was retained with the foreign parent entity. I think I'm slightly digressing, but again, just answered a question which was topical when we were
No
there.
problem, Rajesh. Actually, very helpful. And for the participants, we are looking at your questions. Actually, there are a lot of questions which are popping up on our window. So to the extent possible, we are taking note of them and trying to answer them. But we have a question answer session as well last 10 minutes. So I'm going to now ask both of you a very interesting question. This is relating to splitting up of trademarks. Not many people have experimented with this concept, and this comes with its own set of nuances. For the audience, a very key point is trademarks are always associated with good or service. India follows the NICE classification. We have 45 classes of trademarks. When you say that I have a brand, say Zara, I don't own the brand for everything. I don't have a brand for pharmaceutical. I have it in connection with, say, clothing. I have it in connection with footwear, etc. So your agreements always have to specify that a trademark is assigned in relation to certain goods and services, and those goods and services need to be specified clearly in the agreement. Now, sometimes what happens is that in a same class, we may have different goods, or in a same class, we may have different services, and we want to divest ourselves of some category of goods and services because the business verticals are different. How does one lead to, how does that one deal with this circumstance? So, Gauri, my question to you is twofold. One, where I have mark in the same class, but for different goods or different services, how do I split it up? Can I split it up? And secondly, can I do a territorial split of the trademarks? Is that possible? And I'm going to then switch this question after Gauri finishes to Rajesh to explain the tax consequences.
Sure. So, before I answer your question directly, I think some questions that came up, which also reminded me one clarification that we need to give, that oftentimes you will find that in a particular group, say, let's say Tata, right? The word Tata will be used by all the companies, right? But business. Then the question really arises when when that particular business is being transferred with that trademark. The question is that that trademark has been that with that associated particular business, say suppose it is in relation to truck manufacturing, right? So trucks will fall under particular class, and then the transfer of the brand is happening only in relation to that business, right? So that is one clarification. But then sometimes, again, from a public confusion perspective, etc., whether somebody wants to put a disclaimer, that it is not, now no longer associated with Tata Group, etc., that's a different point. Coming to, that's more of a practical level. Now coming to your direct question, I have seen the split of marks, quite often. I mean, in two circumstances. One which is rare, and the other one could be common. The first one, I will talk about the split of a trademark between Indian territory and foreign territory. When I say foreign territory, I'm talking more in the export context. Of course, trademark is a territorial right. So, of course, Indian registration doesn't grant me any right outside India. That's very clear. But the interesting split that I have seen in the pharmaceutical sector, for example, was a particular company was allowed to have a registration for manufacture and sale within India. Another entity was allowed to hold the trademark for export of the goods with the same trademark outside India. Right? So it is for export and one is for local manufacturing. So that is one type of split I have seen. The other type of split, and of course there could be territorial split within India and all that, which is rare because, again, as I said, consumer confusion, you don't want dual ownership, and because in India it's, trade can happen across states, right? So you don't want that confusion, so which is rare, you will find that to be rare. But the other type of split I have seen is within the same class. I'll give you an example. We have seen in one of the transactions, say class 9, it is a scientific equipments or whatever, or even class 10, or those type of things. Suppose some goods in class 10 or class 9 are used only for pharmaceutical purpose or medical device purpose, right? And the others are, say, your washing machines and television and all that, right? So we have seen a split of the same within the same class, but the split of the trademark. Now the Trademark Act gives three guiding notes. So when the split should be allowed, such a split should be allowed by the trademark registry because a consent is required from the trademark registry. There are three circumstances where such a split may not be allowed. One is the same goods and services. You don't want two-pronged ownership because same protection. You don't want two sources of the same goods and services. Or is the same description service. So that means it may be in different classes, but same goods, same description. So there are certain, I'm not this point, but there are certain circumstances where you will have to convince the trademark registry that such a split is permissible because quite a few people are not even aware that that is possible. And then you have to convince the trademark registry that how likely to cause any confusion, etc., and the bifurcation between the businesses, and then you be able to do such a split of the trademark within the same class as well.
Right. And Rajesh, what about you? What, from a tax perspective, if we do this kind of a split, how do you suggest one deals with it in their books?
So I think there are issue which really comes up, and a lot of it comes. The issue crops up because people don't generally have a good understanding around how intangible products or intangible rights work. As today, when unlike in case of a tangible property, where I cannot really cut it up into different pieces. In case of an intangible property, that ability is there. Whereas Gauri mentioned, wherefore I'm assigning the mark with respect to certain classes, but not in respect of other classes. In a normal situation, this should be treated as again capital gains. None of the treatment changes. However, I should point out that there have been instances where the tribunal at least has looked at it saying that how can you actually do, for example, a territory rights, right? For only for certain territories, how can you actually cut it into pieces? Should this be treated more akin to a royalty as compared to capital gains? Those kind of questions have actually arisen. And a lot of it comes in because people don't necessarily have the good understanding in terms of the fact that intangible rights can be dissected into different pieces. But the normal answer should be that yes, capital gains. Though, as I said, there are always stray instances that you will find where people end up challenging it, saying that no, the classification ought to be different, which means so. But that's again leaving that aside. Otherwise, things don't change.
Right. So thanks, Rajesh, for this answer. Now I'm going to move on to the case studies like I promised the attendees today. But before that, I need both of you to deal with two quick concepts because they're important to understand to appreciate the case studies. Gauri, for you, my question is on competition law related aspects, especially when thresholds are met. And Rajesh, for you, my question is on exchange control, especially when the transactions are cross-border in nature. So to you, Gauri.
So I'll keep it simple. So under the section 5 and 6, when you're talking about combinations, or to put it simply, mergers, acquisitions, etc., under Competition Act, the definition of the term acquisition also includes acquisition of assets, right? So often you will find that even if it's an asset deal, if the thresholds are, I mean, if you don't fall, one is you do falling within the exemptions. I'll not get into numbers and all, but if some question comes up, we'll deal with that. But if you don't fall within minimus exception, and you you end up fall within the, you meet the thresholds for filings, then there is a possibility of rather the permission of the CCI to be obtained before you consummate the transaction. Having said that, till 2007, what we saw, and which was a big issue, is earlier the enterprise from whom the asset is being acquired, full value of the enterprise was taken into account. So suppose you have a, this is very common in pharmaceutical companies, as you can see, the brand transfer, or FMCG sector, it's very common. You simply transfer the brands. I mean, how many times, probably, you have seen the, particular brand, changing hands. What used to happen is that the enterprise value of seller would be taken into account while computing the threshold. Luckily, from 2017, what they have looked at is now the value of the asset. So you look at the asset value and thereafter determine the, whether the thresholds are being met. One interesting aspect, however, going back to the goodwill discussion, when we were talking about the recently in 2020, there is an amendment proposed to the Competition Act. And there in the definition of acquisition, they have given the clarification or something or explanation in terms of the asset or the valuation. There they say that when you're, you have to take into account goodwill as well when you're valuing the brand or rather valuing the asset. The question arises, if my transfer is without the goodwill, the trademark, do I still take that into account while computing the the threshold? So that is one issue that arises. The other issue that arises is that the valuation itself, because there's book value. If it's a homegrown brand, how do you do the book value? I think on a tax you do have an answer, as Rajesh mentioned, but this issue may arise in relation to the valuation of the asset. And the second threshold is a turnover, right? So turnover attached to that particular asset. So I mean, we will just need to look at those two. Luckily, at least what we now is that smaller transactions, even though the enterprise, the seller has a certain threshold or the buyer has a certain threshold, the smaller transactions may not now need to go to the competition commission for the purpose of for the purpose of consummation of transaction.
Great. And I think that's a great relief because we do see a lot of activity around brand acquisitions, at least in this market, which has been going on for a while. So this becomes a relief point for the buyers and the seller. So Rajesh, over to you on the exchange control piece before I move to the case studies.
And interestingly, I did see a question pop up from one of the participants in terms of, and the question is really whether is this a current account transaction or is it a capital account transaction, which really goes to the root of it, because under exchange control regulations, current account transactions are generally permitted under the automatic route unless specifically prohibited. Whereas if a transaction qualifies as a capital account transaction, the rule is that it is prohibited unless specifically permitted. When it comes to, again, brand or intangible assets, there are two different aspects around it. One is that if it is a self-generated asset, so what happens in a self-generated asset is that it never actually, there is no capitalization in the books of account. So to that extent, you actually don't have it reflecting in the balance sheet. In those situations, at least, I think we are relatively comfortable that it should qualify as a current account transaction. The issue becomes a lot more problematic, so to say, where I have bought, for example, trademarks from somebody, which means I've capitalized it in my books. And now if I'm again reselling it or transferring it, it's effectively a asset which is sitting on the capital side of my balance sheet, which is actually being sold. That can potentially be categorized as a capital account transaction. Even in those situations, we've seen even the authorized dealers sometimes take a mixed view. Sometimes they say, okay, we'll go back, get approval from RBI. In other cases, they've gotten comfortable that even though it may have been capitalized, it should not necessarily require approval, but it becomes a touch and feel sort of situation. But where, as I said, self-generated assets, the view is a lot more clearer around it.
Understood. So with that, I'm going to move on to my case studies because we are already on 9:40, which leaves us very little time to cover. But the good news is we covered most of the concepts, so the case studies should go smoothly. And we do have a lot of questions, so we'll spend some time there. So my first case study is we have a buyer and a seller. Both of them are located abroad. Now, abroad can be any location because no international flights are working. So we are free to assume whichever location they are in right now. So both the buyer and the seller are abroad, and there is a transaction which involves sale of trademarks. So Gauri, my question to you is, firstly, can the foreign seller have a trademark registration in India? Secondly, if the trademark registration is in India, can they make the sale? This is part of a global deal. What are your do's and don'ts in this situation?
Sure. So as I mentioned before, of course, foreign party can, of course, directly own a trademark in India, may directly own the trademark in India. But typically what we have seen in a global sort of deals is the issues that arise, are that it is a part of a larger transaction. And then I'm going more on a practical note here because other is very simple. But what we have seen is that you have a very larger transaction where you're doing that particular deal of the assets, right? Which could include other patents and other know-how, etc., etc. Then what happens is that you need to come to of that particular trademark assignment in context to file that entire chunk of the document in the Indian context becomes tricky because you don't want to disclose everything to the Indian registry. The other issue is the stamp duty. Because the moment you come to register a particular document in India, they will get confused as to what is the value of that IP, if at all, on that particular trademark, and then what is the stamp duty to be paid on that. So typically, the advice or the structure is that okay, you may have a global document, but simplicity trademark assignment for the recordal purpose, and then as per your allocation of whatever methodology that you will have for the India piece of the deal, allocate that value, and that sometimes does create tax issues. I'll not get into that, but you allocate a certain value in that particular document for the purpose of registration other with the trademark registry. Otherwise you have a confusion. Number one is for the trademark registry to look at that entire document, which will have lot of confidential stuff, which is a global deal. And secondly, how do you pay a stamp duty and what value do you pay stamp duty? So these two issues typically arise, and that is how we resolve it by making a separate document, identifying a different value, and paying the stamp duty for that.
Right. And Rajesh,
And
my
it is
question to
possible. Yeah.
And Rajesh, thanks, Gauri. And my question to you is that if there is a specific apportionment for the India trademark piece in this global deal, what are the tax considerations that this global transaction team needs to think about? Because now there is an India specific value for India trademark.
I think there are only two issues to my mind that they need to worry about. First one is that going back to the point I was making, that the situs of the trademark is where the holder resides. And on that same premise, since it's a transaction between two foreign entities, the situs will be considered as being outside of India, so there should not be a tax implication as such for this foreign entity, and neither should there be a withholding tax for the buyer. The caveat which I would add is that if the mark has been used in India by the Indian subsidiary of the foreign seller, for example, and there is a license agreement and that license agreement is getting terminated, should the Indian entity be compensated for that, or should the Indian entity be compensated for having the economic ownership of the mark? Unfortunately, that's a concept where which has no legal backing as such, because the legal ownership is with the foreign entity, but it's always been a bit of a push and pull, where we've seen litigations in the past where concept of economic ownership has been bandied around, saying that, well, in substance, it's the Indian entity which is using. But as I said, in any event, the question which really arises is that if there is a termination of the license, should the Indian entity be compensated, or should a portion of the purchase price be allocated to India? I think that's the second question around.
Just to add, what I have seen in several global deals that I have looked into when we have to do this India leg of the transaction, that as Rajesh said, typically there is a value allocated to the Indian entity, in that context. And then the question arises, how do you record that? So, sometimes we have to take into account, because sometimes I know I may be jumping into another case study, but sometimes this seller has a subsidiary, as Rajesh mentioned, and a buyer also has subsidiary. And then there could be a business transfer that happens at the local level, but the brand transfer has happened at the global level. So there are some of these complicated issues that arise, that some value has happened in the local context, but the actual deal is done at the global level. So you have these legs of the transaction, and then the allocation of value as per that. And sometimes we have seen that, as Rajesh mentioned, that in a global deal, the apportionment happens to the local licensee. The payment is being made to the local licensee as an apportionment of the overall deal. And you will also find in the global transactions, you will always have this purchase price allocation or some of those clauses which are very, very detailed, which actually where the seller says or the buyer says that we will allocate the purchase price the way we want. So that also probably, has to be taken into account when we look at these type of deals.
Understood. Thank you. Both of you saved me the trouble of reading out my next case study, actually. But I'm going to mix this up a little bit. Two specific questions, and I'm going to ask both of them together because I believe the answer can be slightly combined, at least not from the tax perspective, but legal perspective. So my question is, we have an Indian buyer, but the foreign seller of a trademark. And if I flip it, we have a foreign buyer, but the Indian seller of trademark. So Gauri, anything that changes from a legal perspective, from a documentation perspective, something that you would like to highlight in this case?
Sure. So I think couple of times we have seen issues. I'll actually deal with couple of FEMA issues that Rajesh mentioned, that when you have a payment, so it's a Indian seller and a foreign buyer, right? And the payments have to come in India within, say, a particular over a period of time, right? Then there are certain timelines. If the payments are not going to come within that timeline, typically the ADs take a view that no, you need to go and take an RBI approval, and we have done that before, where we had to go to RBI to say that these are contingent payments likely to come in later, and therefore it will not come within a given timeline of 9 months, I believe, now under FEMA. So then we will tranche it out. So this is one issue that typically arises. Again, recorded reps and warranties and all. I mean, that doesn't really change. When earlier there used to be some issues on the VAT side, in fact, which I will not get into, but I'm sure Rajesh can deal with the GST aspect. Now, when you have a foreign buyer, sorry, Indian buyer and a foreign seller, there also the question arises when the remittances are happening, then how the documentation structured and the comfort of the AD typically we take on the nature of payment, how it is articulated, etc. And sometimes you do come into non-compete issues as well in the trademark assignment agreements. You do, because sometimes you do have a situation where you don't want a seller or a buyer to continue the business either themselves or subsidiaries or otherwise, right? So how does the non-compete payment sort of sit into that particular document, whether it's a combined or is it separate? So some of these issues arise as well. And in the cross-border context, those issues also from a FEMA perspective, one has to keep in mind.
Sure. And Rajesh, what about you? Because you're in one situation where it's an Indian buyer, the money is received in the hands of the Indian buyer, and the other situation there is a flow of money to outside because the foreign entity is the one who's going to be the recipient of cash in this case, right? Recipient of consideration. So how does tax treatment vary? And if you can also club this with the GST question, because I do see some questions on GST applications on such kind of transactions. Rajesh, you are on mute. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. So I'll just take up on the GST, right? And we've had situations in the VAT context in the past where the question has arisen. For example, if an Indian party was selling brand to a foreign party, will there be a GST on the in respect of the sale of the brand? So even in those situations, we've structured transactions because you have cases from the Supreme Court, which again go back into saying that I will have to look at where the agreement has been executed to see where the transfer has actually happened, where you've had situations where that particular aspect of the transaction was also done outside of India to sort of get around the VAT. So that is definitely one aspect which is there. The only other point I would add is that if an Indian party is actually selling the brand, then the question sometimes that does come into place is that is there any withholding tax? The answer to that is no, because these are all capital gains. but otherwise don't really see anything else.
Understood. And then I do have I mean, since we've been talking about transactional questions, I think reps, warranties, indemnities are a very key part of any transaction document. I can never imagine going through a document without having these key clauses. So, what are some of the important reps, warranties, and indemnities that you see from an IP heavy transaction or trademark centric transaction perspective?
Sure. So whatever I'm going to answer may also hold good, for the other IP transactions as well. The issue always arises, and especially in the context of trademark, is whether my reps on my title are going to be knowledge-based reps, right? Because that's something obviously, that's something the buyer will not agree to. But the reason I may have to say put a knowledge-based rep, like for example, it also depends on the wording. I'll spend a minute here. So suppose I have to make a representation that I'm sole and exclusive owner of the trademark. Now that becomes tricky. Why? Because somebody else, and under trademark law, there is a concept of honest concurrent user. That means somebody else may have simultaneously used the trademark and hold a parallel right to me. So the same trademark, that party is entitled to use, register, because they have created a parallel right. The moment I say that it is sole and exclusive, that's not something then will hold good. Right? So I will typically resist by saying I will not give a rep of sole and exclusive. If at all I'm pushed to the to the wall, I may say to my knowledge, to my best whatever knowledge or whatever the knowledge qualifies, right? So that is something not many people realize, that in the trademark context that issue does arise, and you would an exclusive ownership rep. Then the question also arises is that is the strength of the trademark. So that it is valid and subsisting, and will continue to hold valid and subsisting throughout the term. All these things are, anybody tomorrow can come and challenge my trademark for whatever purpose. So suppose I'm a seller and you are a buyer, and you don't use a trademark in a particular way, or you don't use the trademark at all. As you know, if the trademark is not used for a year than 3 months, it opens itself for challenge. So how can I give a rep, which is a continuing rep, to say that it will hold valid and subsisting? Because it is now, as a buyer, you are the ones who are going to use that trademark. So I cannot do that kind of rep, right? So understanding the trademark law and then giving a rep which is a very carefully drafted rep becomes very important. Otherwise you're just giving just standard reps who say that okay, these are very standard, I have to give them. So understanding this will be very, very important. The other the other issue on the as the point that you mentioned, right? If I have a pending trademark or a renewal has not been given, then what type of a rep can I give? So the rep I can give is still, can I give the ownership rep? The answer is yes, because I'm user of I'm the person who has used the trademark, and the trademark law recognizes the use, which is a common law ownership. So at best I can clarify that I user or a common law proprietor of a trademark at the time of the deal, because then at that stage I don't have a registered trademark, right? So there is a difference between the common law ownership and a registered proprietor ownership, right? Because then it's a statutory right. So these nuances have to be, and for each trademark, so there may be a bouquet of trademark that is getting assigned. So for each trademark, probably you will have to look into the facts of the case and craft your reps and warranties for the facts of the case of that trademark. It cannot be a same rep for all the trademarks, right? Even the strength may be different, right? So I think, if for example, whether the some marks may be descriptive trademarks. So in that case, what type of a rep I want to give, right? So this is something which we have to be very, very carefully understanding, and the negotiations also have to be done accordingly, which is a very reasoned negotiation. And the buyer also needs to understand that yes, this is a factual situation, and the buyer will have to hedge the risk, taking into account the facts of the situation. And in fact, we had a very interesting case sometime back where the trademark appeared descriptive trademark, right? So in that context, we were acting for the buyer, and the other attorneys of the buyer were very apprehensive about the fact that it appears to be a descriptive trademark. And we had to go into a lot of depth in terms of understanding the nature of use and the evidence of use and all that. And we had to take a lot of proper and warranties, even affidavits, seller, evidencing the use of the trademark. So you will have to get into those elements as well, which don't appear like cookie cutter sort of solutions, but customized solutions for that particular fact.
Very, very helpful. And just a point to add, I know I'm slightly digressing, but a lot of times, companies launch their brands in an international market, including India market. Sometimes they even acquire brands because they want to launch it, and they don't do this analysis of strength of trademarks. Sometimes when you don't do this territorial level search, you may realize there are already many conflicting trademarks available in general in usage on the records of the trademark registry, which makes your trademark a slightly weaker trademark. It can also expose you to litigation risk at times. It's very important to do the study of and evaluate what is the strength of trademark in each territorial jurisdiction. Now, I think, Rajesh, there are a couple of questions on valuation here. Since we have very few minutes left, do you want to quickly address some of the...
Yeah, I did notice that there were quite a few questions on valuation, and that's one of the more difficult aspects around trademarks, especially even when you look at transfer pricing, for example, as to or doing any kind of apportionment. How would you actually justify what is the value for the trademark? A simple example: you had a recent deal for Horlicks between HUL and GSK, where they valued the brand at whatever 3,000 crores. So how do you actually arrive at that value? Again, not necessarily a valuer, but one approach is that, for example, if I'm generating royalties out of the trademark, right? Same, go back to your first example where you had a foreign company which had already licensed it to the Indian company. So what I'm effectively then looking at is to say that, okay, what is the potential discounted cash flow of the royalties which I'm going to be receiving, and I'm going to use that to value the trademark. So that's one way of looking at it. Second way is that what is the actual premium pricing which I'm getting because of using the brand, right? For example, the same what's it called formulation that you use for Horlicks, but you don't have the brand. It may sell for 100 rupees, whereas with the brand it's selling for 120 rupees. So there is a 20% premium effectively associated with the brand, and then you're sort of then linking it up to what is the cash flow that you're going to expect to generate. But again, one of the more trickier aspects when it comes to transfer pricing is how do you value intangibles? That's still a developing area, to be honest. People have struggled about it all over the world, but no clear answers. But those are some of the ways in which you sort of look at it.
Thanks, Rajesh. And I think for all those who thought what's really in a name and what can we talk for 1 hour on a brand acquisition session, I'm pretty sure you have a lot to think about. I'm going to end this session, and I'm actually giving 1 minute to Rajesh and Gauri to see if they are going to pick up any more questions. But I'm going to start concluding the session by saying that up till now, when we are talking about trademarks, we have been speaking in the context of traditional trademarks. Traditional trademarks are your logos, your word marks, things that we are very used to. But a new genre of trademarks, unconventional trademarks, is also picking up very fast. These are your shape marks, your sound marks. Remember the Nokia tune, the Yahoo Doodle? Many such new unconventional marks are now picking up. And as we speak today, probably somewhere in the world, transactions for unconventional trademarks are also shaping up. These will bring about newer nuances of law, newer issues, and at that point in time, we'll be back again with a session. I promise you that. But with that note, it's exactly 10 o'clock. I'm going to end the session. For those whose questions weren't answered, we'll try to address them individually. We have your emails, and we do have some research papers online. We have a paper on IP-centric deals. We have some very good tax papers. Please go look it up. You are likely to find most of these answers in those papers, but we are always available if you shoot us an email. Thank you, everyone, for this wonderful session and for spending your evening with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thanks,
Arushi. I would just like to say a few things to our participants. I would like to inform you about our upcoming sessions tomorrow. So at 3 p.m. tomorrow, we have a session, our enforcement agencies behind you, do's and don'ts, the interaction with senior advocate Siddharth Luthra. That's at 3 p.m. And at 6 p.m., there is M&A case study, L&T's hostile takeover of Mindtree. So if anyone is interested, you can go to our website as well as LinkedIn for further details. And thank you so much, everyone. You may now disconnect your line.